I was jolted awake about an hour ago, confused and disoriented. My heart was pounding, and my sheets were soaked in sweat. Some slavering, malevolent horror was in the trailer with me, creeping up on me while I slept, with poised claws and razor teeth. The absolute certainty of this coated my mouth with the metallic taste of fear, sour, dry, and thick. I grabbed the baseball bat that lays beneath my cot and tiptoed around the cramped darkness of my trailer, straining to hear over the keening of the wind outside and the pounding of my own heart. Of course, there was nothing here except my goldfish and yours truly, the sweaty guy in his underwear. It was the gusting wind that startled me awake. It happens quite often in the late autumn and early winter. The wind rips through the scrub of skeletal trees that surround the trailer park and charges with a lion's roar into our lonely huddle of frail little shelters. It gibbers and shrieks and pounds on our walls with fists of dead leaves and frozen grit. Satisfied that I wasn't about to become chow for some unspeakable creature, I laid back down on my squeaky, saggy old cot and tried to get back to sleep. But I couldn't. Instead, I found myself thinking about that night in the penitentiary, the night of the lockdown. I kept thinking about Mikey and Big Rob and the rest of them. All of us huddled in a cell with the lights off and the frigid northwest winds howling at the walls. After a while, I gave up trying to sleep. Instead, I sat down in front of the computer and I started typing. I'm no storyteller, not like Mikey or Hutch, but I'll try my best. When I first came to the pen, the thing that struck me the most about the place was just how much the cons talk. On the occasions when I'd served time in the county jail, there had been talk, sure, but it was terse and impersonal. When they're only serving a few months, I guess a lot of people feel the situation is too temporary to bother forging any ties with their fellow inmates. You'd play cards with your cellie, or you'd sit in the day room and watch TV in relative silence. The only time that there would ever be any noise or action was when a scrap broke out over a card game. Fights were the only thing that passed as excitement in county. Every other moment of the day was comprised of dull, boring nothing. Going in, you just hoped that the food wouldn't be too bad, and that your cellie wouldn't end up being a gang member or a meth head biker waiting out a long patch of dead time. People, in other words, who might beat the shit out of you as a way to pass the hours. The pen, though, it's an incredibly noisy, smelly, vocal environment. I remember very clearly the moment when my little group of new arrivals were let out of the fish tank and into our new home, a pod housing 200 inmates. I was overwhelmed by the deafening din of voices and activity when the hacks marched us, bundles in hand, out onto the range. Of course, there were the obligatory cat calls and wolf whistling, but most of the cons seemed completely oblivious to us. They were too busy living the ebb and flow of penitentiary life. Of course, this was not actually true. Cons see everything, and I mean everything. but they talk even more. My first cellie wanted both my bail and my ass, in that order. That wasn't happening. I hammered him in the mouth and it was on. The fight spilled out of the cell and into the corridor of the pod. He was a big, tough old bull, but I had him leaking, and his confidence was shaking. Before the COs got to us, I managed to get that nasty old fuck face down onto the floor and was whamming away on the back of his head and neck like a jackhammer. Then the hacks got there, and one of them laid a size 12 boot upside my skull. The kick knocked my brain clear over the moon. The world immediately went out of focus, and it stayed that way for almost 12 hours. I spent the next 3 weeks in the hole for fighting, and when I got out, I was placed in a different pod. Word had got around that this fish wasn't exactly new, and that I had a mean right cross. No one bothered to try and roll up on me in the yard that day, and when I sat down to chow with my new cellie and some of his boys, no one objected. I had been checked, and I'd passed the test. I wasn't a punk or a sissy. I could sit with the men. Yeah, it's a different world, the pen is. And it has wildly different rules. You couldn't fully understand unless you've been there. It wasn't long before I settled into a routine. Up for head count and chow, off to work in the laundry, chow, nap, workout, chow, and then the struggle to fill the dead hours between supper and lights out. There wasn't much to do. The cons played cards, betting with tobacco bales purchased from the commissary and individual hand-rolled smokes. Some watched TV, and others watched the wall. Some watched each other. Tensions were always high between the rival gangs. Dope fiends spiked what they liked to spike in the bathrooms. Daddies took their sugar boys into rented cells or the showers, and they got some ass pussy while a homeboy held watch for the cops. And there was, of course, a lot of talk. Talk of family back home, women had and lost, of misdeeds proudly done. There were enough stories flying around that place to fill a library. My cellie was an old con named Mikey. He had originally been sentenced to 15 years for second-degree murder during a robbery, but he'd gotten into so much trouble since landing in the pen that he'd managed to acquire an additional 10 years on top of that. Mikey was doing all day, and he made peace with that fact. A good cat, all in all. A straight shooter who didn't fuck with the spike. The thing was, he'd kill just about anyone if he got it into his head that he wanted to. In earlier years, Mikey had been a trigger man for the bikers. He'd been convicted for the murders of 6 people and was a suspect in 16 others. And I can well imagine that a number of them had probably been friends of his at one point or another. In certain circles, a good friend can become your murderer in the blink of an eye. That's the kind of people you do time with in maximum security. Mikey and his crew liked nothing better than to spend a Sunday evening crowded up in someone's cell, drinking Prono and shooting the shit. Personally, I didn't care much for the hooch. It tasted like rotting garbage with a heavy fruit bouquet. But the stories were welcome. When Mikey or one of his homeboys were on a roll, we could all forget ourselves and be somewhere else for a little while. As far as cons go, they were good fucking guys. They were. And these bull sessions were the glue that held Mikey's crew together. I remember watching and listening for hours on end, spellbound, as Mikey or Big Rob or whoever wove a tapestry of words in the thin air around us. They'd make us roar with laughter, clench in rage, and even silently choke up in sadness. Some of those guys could play a man's emotions like a violin with their storytelling. They were the masters of the form. Most of the time, the stories were pretty coarse, which was to be expected. Look where they were coming from. And occasionally, they were downright fucking horrifying. But there's one in particular that I can remember word for word, quite literally. I can actually close my eyes and see Mikey and Rob Hutch and the rest of them sitting there in the cell that night. All of us bathed in the sickly red glow of the emergency lights and transfixed by what we were being told. This particular story likes to pop up in my head in that small, dead hour of the night, when the harsh winds of drab old November lash and rock my rusty little trailer hard enough to wake me up, as they did tonight. Coincidentally, it was on a November night just like this when I heard this story. I was about a year into my 4-year sentence for armed robbery, and this was my second winter in the pen. I recall that goddamn wind was cutting through the walls really badly that night, and the drafts were freezing our toes solid. There had been a murder that day, and the whole pen was on lockdown. All 5 pods, and the protective custody unit too. Big Rob Hutch was a man who had his ear to the ground, and he had known that the lockdown was imminent. We had just enough time to make preparations for what was coming. Happy for a chance to hang out and get fucked up, 7 of us quickly herded into a cell with our bedding, snacks from the commissary, and as much gear as we can get our hands on. I remember that we were all wrapped up in our thin, scratchy blankets like convict burritos. The blankets were gray and made of rough wool. Upon checking into the Razor Wire Inn, you were issued one and one only. In the winter, blankets were at a premium. Men would fight for them, sometimes even kill for them. Mikey and Big Rob were both sitting on the lower bunk. Coltrane and his kid Remy had the top one. I was freezing my ass off on the floor, along with Nick and Richie. The young pups had to sit on the floor. That's just the way it was. The old cons got to snuggle their asses into the relative comfort of the thin mattresses that covered the squeaky spring slats. And in Coltrane's case, the old con's bitch as well. We weren't complaining out loud about it though. We knew better than to do that. Big Rob was a trustee, and one of his duties was to mop the floors in the prison morgue. He was telling us what had happened when the coroner performed his autopsy on Stutters. Stutters was a junkie who had been suspected of ratting out various other cons to the cops in exchange for smack. He was the reason why the entire pen was on lockdown. He had been discovered in his bunk after lunch, dead as day-old dog shit and full of ragged holes. The shiv was found in a toilet in the shower room. It had been made from plastic bags, heated to melting with a bic, then compressed to form a sturdy, sharp little weapon.
So I'm mopping up by where they keep the gurneys, and down the hall the doors open a bit, so I can see the doc leaning over Stutters on the table. He's humming and singing to himself like usual, and I'm smiling at how shitty his voice is, when all of a sudden the doc says, "Holy shit, would you look at that?" And then he starts gagging and retching. Then get this. Then he actually screams. For real, he fucking screamed. and he yells, "Jesus Christ, it's all over my fucking arm." He runs out of the room and down the other hall, and I'm like, what the fuck is all that about? I heard him yelling for his assistants, or whatever they are, the younger ones. They all come running back, and I heard one of the assistants say, "Oh fuck, you gotta be kidding me." Then the smell hits me from all the way down that long ass hallway, and it's putrid, boys. It smelled like a combination of rotting flesh and an old shithouse in August. I had to grab my nose and run the fuck out of there. Worst thing I ever smelled.
Nick asked, "What was it from?" and shifted uncomfortably where he sat beside the toilet. He was a good bit younger than me. He just celebrated his 20th birthday a few months ago. It was his first time in, and he'd drawn the fucking short straw. 15 years. 8 before he'd be considered for parole. His uncle, fortunately for Nick, was also serving time in the same facility. He was an upper echelon Hell's Angel who ruled both B-Pod and C-Pod with an iron fist. As a result, Nick was getting the easiest ride a first-timer to the pen ever had. Coltrane and Mikey had personally welcomed the kid into the crew, as per the old man's orders. He was fresh-faced and physically soft. I occasionally wondered if he ever really known just how bad it could have been for him in there.
"Apparently,"
Big Rob said, lowering his voice to a husky stage whisper,
Stutters was getting checked for pokes and track marks pretty regular because he got busted so much for possession. So he started shooting it in his ass. But not like in his ass cheek, you dig? I mean, right into the wall of his rectum. He was shooting it right in his fucking asshole, man. Can you imagine that? Pretty soon, he developed a fucking horrible abscess. Because of all the fecal bacteria and crap that was living up his old dirt road, the abscess got infected real bad. After a while, it skinned over with the crust of white blood cells and gross stuff and ballooned out into a giant pus bubble. That bubble got so big that it eventually closed up the poor fucker's ass. And I mean right fucking shut. He was apparently going around like that for weeks, man. For real. Weeks. It must have hurt like a bitch. So, the doc saw something kind of bubbling out of the dead fucker's asshole, and he prodded at it with his scalpel, and out gushes a metric fuckload of bloody green pus, full of dead bacteria stinking like the devil's ball sack. Oh, fuck. That's just dirty, man.
Mikey groaned, and mimed throwing up all over Hutch. We were all wrinkling our noses in disgust and shaking our heads. Dirty was not nearly adequate for this disgusting image.
That ain't it though, my friend. That ain't it. The worst part, he continued, was the fact that Stutters had been bunched up with this fucking pus balloon for a few weeks or so, you know? It stopped up his shit canal. When the doc popped that thing with his scalpel, oh hell. It was a literal shitstorm. It spurted out of his ass like a high-pressure hose.
We regarded that image for a moment or two in stunned silence. I felt a bit ill.
So fucking dirty.
Mikey roared, and despite what I just heard, I had to laugh. Coltrane and the others joined in. Remy just looked disgusted. He was filing his nails. Remy was no longer just another cell block punk, a weaker man that traded what he had to trade in order to get by in a world dominated by strength. In recent months, he'd gone and went full-blown sissy, After a year or so of enduring the subservient female role at the receiving end of Coltrane's hog leg, Coltrane was, in fact, the one who turned Remy out in the first place. He'd finally stopped playing the part of a woman and was now living it. It was apparent that he'd started taking illicit female hormones. His arm hair had thinned out, and it seemed that he had recently grown the barest suggestion of breasts beneath his orange jumpsuit. By the time I got out of the pen, Remy had changed his name to Rianne and was the wife of, get ready for this, none other than Nick's uncle, the unofficial king of pods B and C. Rianne was known for causing savage fights amongst inmates who were vying for his attention. That, incidentally, was exactly how Coltrane ended up earning an unexpected early parole. A backdoor parole, as they call it. Because you don't leave through the front gate when you're dead. So, the doc got shit on by a corpse, said Richie in a slow and dreamy tone. It was pus-covered shit. That's fucked up, man. Hey, do you think that happens a lot to him? Or was that the first time? Richie had snorted some hydromorphone earlier, and now he was somewhere in the clouds, floating around with a stone grin on his face. Richie, that's just fucking... Mikey trailed off. Actually, it's a good question. Want some hooch, boys? I was just opening my mouth to say fuck no, and then there was a pop, and everything went dark. The cons began yelling and hooting all across the pod, both tiers on both sides. Big Rob yelled, "Shut up, you fucking idiots! It's just a blackout, for Christ's sake! Pipe the fuck down!" And for a wonder, some of them actually did. The thing was, Big Rob Hutch was, well, just that. Big. He was as big as a buffalo. I was surprised that the lower bunk could support both Rob and Mikey, who wasn't exactly small himself. The emergency lights snapped on, soft and red and eerie. It made the common area of C-Pod look like a scene from an apocalyptic horror movie. We could see the guards standing there in the guard hut through the bulletproof glass, waiting to see how the cons were going to react to the power going out during a lockdown. Now, not only were we being sequestered in our cramped little cells for an indeterminable length of time, we'd also been rendered unable to properly read a book. A number of the cons could actually read, and did, or see your hand while playing cards, or even listen to the radio, for Christ's sakes. The hack was a dark figure swathed in dim red, his body language alert and poised for action. I'm pretty sure it was Robson who was the boss on hut duty that night. Robson was a dead-eyed, square-jawed oaf without an ounce of empathy in his whole body, and he just so happened to have a 12-gauge shotgun on hand with a modified choke. I fervently hoped that no one would take it into their heads to start some serious shit, because if they did, there was a good chance we'd all regret it. There was a lot of hollering and door kicking around the pod, but it soon became apparent that the ruckus was just for show, and it was half-hearted at best. We all silently thanked whoever might be listening that the emergency reaction team wasn't going to be called in. The ERT didn't fuck around. Kevlar suited and anonymous in their visored helmets, they'd march into the pod and indiscriminately barge into cell after cell, busting heads and whapping out teeth with their batons. Hell, you might even get shot, and the ERT shoot to kill. Richie broke the silence. Man, I was getting real worried there for a minute. If the fucking goon squad busted in here and found all our shit, we'd be dicked. Richie was doing 6 years for selling pills, the sentence for a second-time loser. Oxycontin and hydrocodone were his chemicals of choice. Faced with the boredom of prison life, he started using the products he sold. He was a straight-up junkie by Christmas of that year. Mikey didn't care about anyone using junk, would even have a little snort here and there himself. But he didn't like addicts, not one bit. He cut Richie out of the crew. Addled by junk, plagued by debt, weak and alone, Richie ended up bunking with some fellas from the top tier across from us, the black tier. In a maximum security penitentiary, this has unpleasant connotations. Business might occur between the color lines, but that's generally where any benign fraternization ends. You might not be racist when you're on the outside, but when you're inside, you don't have much choice. To be blunt, it's like this. If you're white, you stick with the whites. The black and Hispanic cons don't want to be your buddy, and vice versa. There are, for a variety of reasons, a large number of hostilities between the color lines. They'll stomp the shit out of you, or worse. When we got word that Richie had been seen walking, his face cast down, up the stairs to that second tier, well, we knew. Richie had heavy debts, forced to either trade himself or die. Richie had chosen life. Jesus. I felt horrible for how it ended for Richie. I still do. His desperate last bid to cling to his wretched mortal existence only prolonged the inevitable. He was dead within a month. One day, after enduring his morning gang rape, something must have finally snapped in Richie's head. His will to live crumbled and fell. Richie stayed behind while his tormentors went down for morning chow, and he stuck a spike in his arm for the last time. High as a kite, Richie then hung himself from the corner post of the top bunk. He did it with a rope made of knotted together socks. I'm rambling now, aren't I? Sorry. I do that sometimes. You'll just have to bear with me, I guess. I'm not good at this. Not like Mikey or Hutch. I'm just a lonely guy who can't sleep some nights, when the shrieking wind could be mistaken for the wailing of lost souls, shaking and rattling the windows in their frames. Even though I was released from the pen 15 years ago, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still somehow inside. But I suppose we're all imprisoned by something, on some level, aren't we? On nights like tonight, my prison is this rusty trailer. It's my pathetic, menial job, my divorce, my raw, red-eyed fury, unfocused and impotent. It's sorrow and regret. On nights like tonight, my prison is the past, and my inability to leave it behind. So there we all were, sitting there in the weird red gloom and listening to all the yelling and bullshit slowly dying down. Richie abruptly went on the nod. Nick balanced a shoe on his head. We all chuckled. Coltrane started talking about the hockey game that was about to start, then abruptly shut up. We were on lockdown with no electricity. There would be no hockey game that night for us. We passed a J around, and when that one was roached, we passed another. Finally, Mikey spoke up and broke the silence. So, Who's up for some Twilight Zone shit tonight? I got a good one for you. Remember the last time the power went out, Hutch? Hutch shot him a dark look, then did something very unusual for a hardened con. He shuddered. You want to tell the boys that story? I don't know, man. Why not? Fuck. The lights are out and the wind's a howling out there. Perfect time for it. Okay. Fuck it. Let's do it. Big Rob cleared his throat and said, Okay, boys. It's time for a scary story. Crowd around the fucking campfire and grab a cup of this fine wine. It's more of a brandy, I think, Hutch. Mikey grinned and offered me some. Reluctantly, I accepted a styrofoam cup of the murky, eye-watering stuff and steeled myself to swallow it. I was feeling a bit happier now. I've always been a fan of spooky stories. His voice stern, Mikey growled. Okay, first things first. This shit is 100% true. Got it? We're not bullshitting about any of this. For real. So don't tell us that we're full of shit or you can go have a fucking sleepover with that asshole over there in the hack shack. Got it, Richie grunted, then flopped over onto the floor. He was out of it. This all went down a long time ago, before any of you were here. At least 12 years, I'd say. Mikey? Yeah, for sure. At least that long. Back when these little punks were still giving out hand jobs at juvie.
It was a while back anyways. Me and Mikey here were both running with different crews back then. Into different shit. But we knew each other. I guess it would have been about your age,
he said, pointing down at me.
So one day, the fish tank had just been emptied out into the pod, and there's a new fish with him that immediately starts turning heads. I was playing checkers on the tier upstairs when they all came walking through the gate, looking like a bunch of lost little lambs down there on the range. They came toddling in behind a couple of the hacks, and at the end of the line is the prettiest little sweet boy this whole penitentiary has ever seen. I don't play no grab ass like Coltrane up there, but this kid, he was, I don't know, almost like an angel or something. He was too perfect, like a picture out of a magazine, you know? Slender and fair-haired, teeny bopper heartthrob material. Yeah, the kid was pretty alright, and he looked like he'd be easy to punk.
Big Rob took a moment to pause and force back a swig of the awful, cloying Pruno, a noxious blend of fermented fruit, sugar packets, and yeast. As he grimly swallowed it down, Mikey jumped in and continued the story. The new fish immediately drove the whole pod completely fucking nuts. The wolves were losing their minds, for real. The guards were looking worried. A pretty kid like that can cause a lot of hard feelings between the bulls. Hard feelings usually turn into murder. So they released the other fishies to the care of the boss at the guard hut, then hustled the pretty boy off to protective custody post-fucking haste. They kept him there for a few days, but the wolves didn't forget about him. Not for a moment. All the time, they're asking about the kid to the trustees who had access to PC. They're asking if the kid's lonely, if he wants a candy bar or a fuck book or a bag of fucking horse, whatever the kid might possibly want.
They're handing the trustees love notes to give to him. Money, weed, all kinds of shit. Finally, a con named Holbrook called in some heavy favors, and the hacks moved the kid back into the pod. More to the point, into Holbrook's cell. I remember watching as the hacks walked the young fellow across the pod and up the stairs to his new home. The kid had no expression in those wide blue eyes. None at all. Just blank.
Holbrook was a big, greasy son of a bitch. Real nasty. You could smell him from 20 feet away. Complete psycho, that guy. Man, I'll tell you, watching as Brookie grinned and waited at the door for his cell for his new little bunk buddy to arrive, hell, it made me feel sorry for the kid. He was planning to do bad things to the boy. You could see it in that grin. He was gonna hurt him. No expression at all, though, on that kid's face. I remember thinking that the fishy was either brave as fuck or just too stupid to understand what was in store for him.
Rob tossed back the rest of the hooch in his Dixie cup and tried not to gag.
God, this shit is just fucking awful. Who broke this?
His voice sounded dry and burnt. Our fine neighbors just down the hall, that's who. Mikey chuckled. They managed to hide it in the toilet tank long enough to get her finished. And holy Jesus, ain't it nasty?
Fuck. I think I'm going blind already.
Hutch held out his cup and Mikey poured him another glurt out of the plastic bag, taking care to make sure that the sock he was using as a filter didn't slip out and spill rotting fruit cocktail all over the bunk. I tried a sip of mine and almost retched. They all had a good hearty har at this, except for Richie, I guess. Richie was still laying on the floor, his eyelids fluttering and twitching. It broke more than a few hearts to see Holbrook get his dirty hooks into the kid first. He would wreck that kid's asshole and destroy his soul. That was the general consensus. Come morning, they'd be rolling the kid out to the infirmary and afterward probably stick him back into PC for a 24-hour suicide watch. Even if he did come back to the pod again, no one would want the kid. Not after the permanent damage that Brookie was liable to do to him.
See how lucky you are?
Coltrane said to Remy, and the little Frenchman smiled down at his nails in response, then kept filing them delicately with all of his concentration. Every now and then, I wonder if Remy was already planning the flirtations and indiscretions that would inevitably result in Coltrane's murder. His skull smashed in with a 20-pound dumbbell in the weigh pit. Coltrane, the bull queer who had taken Remy's manhood and eventually transformed him into something he'd probably never wanted to be. Thinking about it now, I'm pretty sure he was. And I can't blame him for it. Rob told us,
I heard screaming that night. It was muffled, but I could still hear it. So did my cellie. Back then, it was old Johnny Franzini. I whispered out of him, Hey, you hear that shit, man? Fuck, that's awful. And he answered, real matter of fact, that boy, he hadn't known it was coming, eh? He's too pretty like a girl to be here in this place. He should never have come here. As if the guy had a fucking volunteered or something. I just shook my head and told Johnny to go to sleep. I felt so bad for the kid, you know? I think that was one of the worst nights I ever had in here.
I heard it too, Mikey interjected. I think we all did, including the bosses on duty that night. But no one went to check on him because money makes the fucking rules around here. Not the warden or the government. It's money. I don't doubt that sick fuck offered big coin for the kid. And some cold son of a bitch sold him without a second thought.
Hutch nodded sourly. Money's a whore. That's okay though, because there's this thing called karma too. When morning came, lo and behold, Brookie ain't standing out of his cell, waiting to be accounted for. Neither is the kid. A whisper popped up real quick and spread down the lines like the breeze, and it said Holbrook went apeshit on the kid last night and killed him. He's waiting in his cage for the ERT to come in and bust his head. The boss doing the head count paused at Holbrook's cell, and every con craned his head to see what was going to happen next. All of us in unison. I seen the hack pull out his radio and with one hand and his club with the other. He started talking real fast into his radio. At the same time, he's slowly walking towards the door of Brookie's cell with his club poised to bash a skull in, like he's trying to ward someone off. He started yelling for the other hacks to get the fuck over there, pronto. They all come thundering past with their keys jangling and their boots clomping. And then we all got ordered to step back into our cells with empty bellies. I heard them down there at Brookie's cell, yelling into their radios and stomping around. And then I heard someone barf. I heard the puke splatter on the tiles. We had to stay in our cells for a few hours, and there was a lot of bitching. I remember being totally, completely pissed at Holbrook, me and Johnny F. We'd assumed that he'd gone psycho on the new fish and cut the kid's throat while he was fucking him, or some shit like that. But then some of the emergency response guys came past wheeling a gurney. And when they wheeled it past us again, you could have knocked me flat with a pea shooter. Because it was Holbrook strapped in there, not the kid. I only saw him for a few seconds, but I remember that his face was fucked. It was mostly gone, stripped right down to bloody sinew and bones. No skin or muscles left. It was fucking gruesome. I kinda gasped out loud and even close-mouthed. Crooked-nosed old Johnny Francini had to look twice and say, what the fuck? The only way I knew it was him was the hair. A big greasy mop of it, like a caveman. The sheet covering the body was soaked right through with his blood. I think that the rest of him had matched his face.
Nick whistled and said, "Fuck, man. That's hardcore." Then sparked up another joint. We floor dwellers had almost forgotten about the discomfort of our numb behinds and tingling feet. We'd forgotten the lockdown and the power outage, and even poor Stutters, who had not only died a violent death, but also died with his ass blocked up by a 6-stick sore the size of a man's fist. Mikey and Hutch were telling a story, and we were living it. You know what I mean? We were right there. Mikey said, "Must have been 5 minutes later. The cops were rolling this crazy looking thing down the block, and I'm like, what the fuck is that?" to my cellie. But he don't know either. Before too long, they roll it past us again, and I'm like, oh shit, look at this. You ever see Silence of the Lambs? That dolly cart thing that they strap Anthony Hopkins into when they're moving him? Yeah, that's exactly what that was. And they've got the kid strapped into it. Bite mask and everything. And the kid is just soaked in blood, man. It was dripping off his clothes and I could hear it pattering on the floor behind him. It left a trail on the floor.
They let us out for breakfast about a half hour after that. But by then, it was almost lunch, and we got served a fucked up mix of warm lunch and cold breakfast. There was more talking going on than eating, though. And everyone was saying the same thing. We were all saying, what the fuck did the kid do to him? Most people thought he must have gotten a hold of Brookie's shift somehow, then sliced the fucker's shit right off, whittled him right down to the bone. But Brookie was a really big dude, and the guy was a crazy motherfucker. How a skinny little bitch like that could have overpowered a bad dude like Holbrook so easily? Well, we didn't know.
The joint traveled across the floor, folk, and was then handed up to the bunks. Mikey hit it hard and made the funny choking noise that older guys sometimes do when holding in a big toke, nasal and strangled. He gave Nicky the thumbs up and blasted out smoke like a grizzled old dragon. It's pretty good, Nicky. Good score. Gotta get some more of that. So, yeah, the kid, he got rolled off to the hole on this fucking Hannibal Lecter dolly. And they had him on a super tight lockdown. Nobody even catches a glimpse of him. They had the kid on a 24-hour watch and the whole works. A couple of trustees tried asking the hacks what happened with him and Brookie, and they got told to mind their own business and mop the fucking floors. The kid was in the hole for a week, then 2, then a month. All the while, ain't no one heard a peep about him getting charged with murder. There was a rumor going around that the coroner said in his report that Holbrook had died from a heart attack. Maybe his heart ceasing up was the thing that actually killed him, sure. But there wasn't any mention of the way he had been carved up like a Sunday turkey. None at all. Mikey poured himself another round of refreshment, and the stink of the open bag made my eyes water. Hutch smiled a little, an action with no real humor behind it.
Well, tongues were wagging, as they tend to do, and pretty soon people were saying that maybe the kid wasn't natural, that he did Brookie in with his teeth, that he ate the fucker alive, like some sort of monster. Guys were even saying that the priest paid him a visit in the hole, and ended up leaving with tears in his eyes, actually fucking crying and shit. Wouldn't say what happened, just that he didn't want to talk to the kid, never again. He quit working here not long after that. Just up and quit. And I heard that the padre ended up selling his house and moving away, like across the country, somewhere far, far away.
Mikey's iron gray beard split with a slight grin of his own. Now here's where shit gets really weird.